Hi, my name's Melissa, and I'm going to be talking about the analysis of 12 Years a Slave as well as Birth of a Nation. So in this PowerPoint specifically, I'm going to be talking about Birth of a Nation, and in the other PowerPoint, Ethan is going to be giving the analysis of 12 Years a Slave. So, in a brief outline, again, I'm going to be talking about Birth of a Nation, and first I'm going to talk about how slavery was portrayed in the film, and I have several examples of different scenes of how slavery was shown throughout the film. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the adaptation to freedom that the slaves had and how the film showed the slaves adapting to freedom. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how this film compared to the time period in history that it was produced. So first, I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the film. So this film is about a preacher, Nat Turner, who is shown here. He is a slave preacher who goes to different plantations to preach to the slaves so that they can remain hopeful and stay in line and hopefully listen to their masters. And so as Nat goes to all of these different plantations, he begins to see the mistreatment of all the slaves and ends up organizing and leading a slave rebellion in hopes to lead the slaves to freedom. So the portrayal of slavery, the first example that both Ethan and I talked about was how they showed the slaves for sale. And so this was a screenshot taken from the film. This little boy is holding up a sign, and there was like an auction going on basically that slaves were being sold. And so the way that this worked was slaves were being shown off for their best physical attributes. So in this picture here, we see this man had just bought this slave, and he was looking at his teeth to see like if he was in good physical health or a good condition or strength. And here we see Cherry Ann, who eventually becomes a very important character in the film. And the way that she was looked at was in more of a sexual light, because as people were bidding prices on her, you could see some of the people in the auction were grabbing at their pants and looking at her as a way to like abuse her or use her, not for like anything physical. So again, it was done auction style, as you can see here. So the slave and the man standing on the wagon, that's the slave for sale, and that man here is the one who's organizing the auction. And so basically he's the one negotiating the prices, and the slave will be sold to the highest bidder. So the next example of slavery that Ethan and I talked about was slavery as a community of its own. So even though these slaves were being forced to work against their will and they were living on this plantation, they lived on the plantation almost as a community. So a good example of this was the wedding. So this is the wedding of Gabrielle Union's character, and as you can see, everybody in the screenshot that I have provided, they all look very happy. This whole scene actually was like a really big celebration. Everybody was really excited to celebrate their love. Also, when Nat and Cherry got married, it was very small and intimate. They didn't show like the party of it, but the whole community like gathered to be at their wedding, and Nat's grandmother actually married the two, so you can see that community was very like prevalent and important in this film. Also, like the houses that they had were organized in a small community almost. So like in this clip here, you can see like this is Nat and Cherry Ann's house, and like that's their daughter. And you can see like they have a clothesline here, and then part of the screenshot that I couldn't get was you can see the other houses like lined up next to them, and you know that these are the other like slaves' houses. Something that I thought was interesting was like the families were being kept together. So as you can see here, this is Nate and Cherry Ann's daughter shortly after she was born. It was interesting to me that these families were kept together, especially because like when slaves are sold, they really don't have a preference or like any sympathy to keep families together. So it was really nice to see, and interesting honestly to see that Nate and Cherry Ann's daughter were kept together. Also, Nat's family was also kept together, because in the beginning of the film you saw it was Nat, his grandma, and his parents, and before his father had ran away. So family was like really important. The next example of slavery that I'm going to talk about is how raw, graphic, and abusive it was. So first, I'll talk about the rape of Cherry Ann. So in this screenshot here, it shows Nat and Cherry Ann after she was raped. And so he basically like went to her and told her like, who did this to you? I want to help them. I want to help you and like get justice for you. And she couldn't really talk much, but she ended up like reciting Bible verses to him, and it was like a very touching moment, and he was like very vulnerable at that time. Along with like the sexual exploitation of slaves, I don't have a screenshot because I couldn't really get a clear picture, but at the dinner party that Nate's master threw, at the end, one of the men that came to the dinner party wanted to sleep with one of the slaves, even though she was married and she had a husband, which was the wedding scene that I showed in the previous slide. And so Nate's owner basically was like, I don't care if you're married, like if you don't give your wife up, I'm gonna lynch you. So obviously he didn't have much of a choice, and so he gave his wife up, and she was very upset because she came out of the house and she was crying and she just felt really bad, excuse me. So you can see that there was a lot of sexual exploitation with the women. The next example I'm going to show you is like the poor treatment of slaves, and so specifically this scene stood out to me, which is when Nat was going to his first plantation, different plantation, to start preaching to other slaves, and this master basically had these two slaves locked up, and they weren't eating, and so he took this slave here on the left. He actually like took a mallet and a hammer and took his teeth out, and then put a funnel in his mouth and force fed him so that he would eat. And then the slave here shown on the right, he was taken out and forced to listen to Nat preach. And actually this was the first plantation that Nat preached at where he kind of really gave hope to the slaves, and when he was preaching, the slaves were like, amen, hallelujah. You can see that they were really resonating with like the words that he spoke. The last thing, how they portrayed slavery, was in terms of like the lynching and the whippings. So in this screenshot that I have shown here, this is after the slave rebellion had happened, and obviously the white men are very angered that these slaves had like rebelled and killed all these women, men, and children. And so the way that they retaliated was killing all black people and all slaves, like no matter if they were involved in the rebellion or not. They just killed lots and lots of innocent families. So as you can see here in this scene, this is like a whole family that's lynched. This looks like a little boy, and these possibly could be his parents, his grandparents, and maybe his extended family. But they really didn't sympathize whether you were involved or not. That just showed how angry the white men were that this rebellion was happening. This scene is when Nat gets whipped for the first time after talking back to his owner. And so he was severely whipped here, and he was left there until the next morning. And so his consequence for talking back was that he was not allowed to preach anymore, because his owner realized that him preaching was giving other slaves power, and his motives were to be unruly, and it wasn't really keeping the slaves in line. So the way that the film showed an adaptation to freedom was like showing that the slaves had some freedom but not complete freedom. So a big thing that Ethan and I talked about was the fact that Nat was allowed to preach. It was interesting that he was also a literate slave, because in the early scenes of the film, the plantation owner's wife says that Nat has a special gift and she wants to teach him how to read. So she teaches him how to read the Bible basically because he's not smart enough to read like white people books. And so that's how he becomes a preacher. Also, some of the slaves were allowed to leave the property as long as they had like a note of permission from their masters that they were allowed to leave. So an example of this would be when Cherry Ann is going to the well to fetch water and the three white men approach her and they say that she's off of property so she needs a note. And Cherry Ann's understanding was that the well was on property and that she was just doing something for her master's wife. And so the three white men were saying, if you don't show me your papers, something bad's going to happen to you. And so ultimately, since she didn't have her papers, since she thought that she was on land, on her owner's land, that's when she was raped. The last thing I'm going to discuss was the film's comparison to history. So in the After Slavery clip that Dr. Smith put up, he talked towards the end of it about like the age of rage, and so like using violence to get your point across, basically. And so the example of this would be like the slave rebellion in the film. The way that Nat had explained it after he had this vision from like this really beautiful black angel was that he was going to take the slaves to Jerusalem, which was a town nearby where all of the plantations were. And so they were basically fighting for their freedom, and then their plan was to start at his plantation, at Nat's plantation, and kill his masters, and then move on to the next plantation and kill those masters and take those slaves, whoever wanted to come and fight for their freedom, and basically go from plantation to plantation and like growing this army of slaves to eventually get to Jerusalem and defeat all of these other white men so that these slaves could be free. So the rebellion lasted around 2 days, and after it was completed, it wasn't completed, they were eventually stopped. Nat went into hiding, and so eventually he was obviously found and lynched for his crimes. And so his last words were, "I'm ready," which I think are really important because it shows that he wasn't scared or worried about what happened. He thought that what he did was right, and he thought that he was like paving the way for like progression and for other people to like, other slaves to like stand up for themselves. So in conclusion, I've talked about several different things, different examples of slavery that were shown in Birth of a Nation. I also talked a little bit about how the slaves showed some of the freedom that they had, and then I ended with showing how the slave rebellion in Birth of a Nation was the way of depicting the age of rage that Dr. Smith had talked about in the After Slavery video clip that we watched for class. So thank you for watching.